Good evening. My name is Pablo Sánchez León. I am the PI of a project called Crossing Through Decadence, Temporary Agency and Institutions in the Portuguese, Hispanic, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, 1700s, 1900s. It's a project sponsored by the Spanish Ministry of Science. And this is the first of a series of seminar sessions in which we will be inviting different people for dealing with different topics. But I decided to start the seminar with sort of broadcasting and presentation of a book, which I think covers interesting parts of the topics and the frame of the kind of research and narrative that I want the project to develop in order to produce a sort of renewal of the vision of a Hispanic empire in the transition to modernity. The book is called The Translated Nation, Translation as Ecology in a Long 18th Century. It was published by the Spanish publisher Marcial Pons in 2025, just a few months ago, and the editors are José M, Iñurritegui and Julio Pardos. I am one of the contributors to this book, so I think I have some kind of authority to talk about it, make some kind of summary of it, and then the session will continue with an intervention by other of the co-authors of the book, Adriana Luna-Fabritius from the University of Helsinki, who will take care of part of the content. And then José María Portillo Valdés, another co-author contributor of the book, also from the University of the Basque Country, like me. I'm speaking from the Institute of Social History, Valentín de Foronda. And this is what I think that I can tell about this book. There is a great deal of literature on the link between language dynamics and nation building, though not extensively on the Hispanic case. Even fewer works triangulate these dynamics with legal issues, whether by linking language and nation to the development of the modern constitutional framework, or simply by focusing on the neologisms and coinages of national semantics that accompany the institutional reforms of the Enlightenment. But what is truly rare is to offer a thesis, not merely a hypothesis, that the binding substrate of these three elements, language, law, and nation, lies in translation. And yet this book we present here does not claim to be a book of or about translation, but rather a book of history. But this is not either a history book viewed through the lens of translation. The Translated Nation is a title that can be ambiguous, both in Spanish and English. It is not a work about how the nation, the Spanish nation in this case, is translated into other languages or cultures, but rather a collection of chapters by various authors who consider translation as a significant foundation for the transformation of the Hispanic community from an empire made up of kingdoms to a nation. Furthermore, this process is observed in light of its contextual experience. That is, it arose from or was accompanied by a certain awareness that the community into which the Hispanic Empire had historical impact should be defined by the status that translation held within it. To understand this proposal and the meaning or span and scope of translation in this context, it is first necessary to consider the history outlined in the book by one of its editors. In a chapter that serves more as a contextualization than an introduction, Professor Julio Pardos narrates the process by which translation came to be embraced as the legacy that the Catholic monarchy bequeathed to posterity. This process resulted from the confluence of two transnational manifestations of collective cultural consciousness that occurred in the second half of the 17th century. The military defeat and the rise of France to continental hegemony in the wake of the Peace of Westphalia. From the perspective of official Hispanic culture, this scenario left little room to emphasize the value not only of the imperial structure, but also of the most basic nature of the Spanish people. There were no longer weapons to boast of, but neither were there any letters to authors in the first instance, given the rise of Francocentric culture and its language, which accompanied the hegemony of the Sun King's monarchy, Louis XIV. It is within this context of the second half of the 17th century, and amidst what appears to be a stagnation in the status of Hispanic culture regarding a communicable self-description and any prospect of achieving recognition, that the phenomenon occurs, which gives reason and meaning to the book's premise. The argument will be to assert that what is genuine and exceptional about Hispanic culture, due to its status as a monarchy with universalist aspiration and its providentially justified goals of religious conversion, is the central role that translation plays within it. Furthermore, this translation is exceptional because of its variety and dialectical nature. It is not simply that Castilian Spanish had embraced translations from other languages, or that, conversely, the imperial hegemony of the Habsburgs had fostered a proliferation of translations of Castilian works into other languages. No, the specificity that becomes aware in the second half of the 17th century is that the characteristic of the culture that germinated under the auspices of the Hispanic Empire is distinguished by the weight that translations from one language to another have in it, making the metropolitan Hispanic land a kind of an unusual node of interculturality, since it does not coincide with the modern conception of universality, which this thesis certainly reveals in its unilateral and Eurocentric creed claim. The universality inherent in the thesis of a Hispanic culture, essentially founded on or oriented towards interlinguistic and intercultural translation, rather than being univocal or monocentric, is not found in the register of modernity, which always has some national language as a source of dissemination, be it French or English. In the history situated at the origin of this book, Castilian as a language does not claim a central or even leading position. Its most significant effect, however, is the establishment of Castilian as the language of the Spanish nation, as a result of the process of definition revealed by the collective studies here gathered. Many of the translations compiled in the lists at the end of the Habsburg dynasty are neither from nor into Castilian, but rather from or into Latin, for example, which remained the language of scholarship for theology and jurisprudence. The protagonist of this book is translation. It is also, as is evident, its subject of reflection. For what is discussed here is not the simple, though inherently complex, transfer of discourse from one language to another. The translation that is the focus of this book is so insofar as it produces collective culture, consciousness, and identity. This identifying translation is also a defining dimension of a historically specific form of collective identity, the nation. One of the three themes that permeate or frame the book's contributions is now becoming clear: language as translation, and translation as the foundation of nationhood. There are certain topics that appear out of this focus. One is the figure of the translator himself or herself, not in its technical nature as an erudite or expert, but in the condition on one side as an intercultural mediator, innovating language and languages through neologisms and adaptations from other languages and other cultures, or different genders of the culture, and other as the forging himself of the nation, of its cultural imagination. The separation between author and translator is diluted. Sometimes many of them, as translators, are the ones that choose the works they decide to translate. So they are not doing it as being in charge by somebody else, but for the for the purpose of taking position into an inherently political struggle to give to the magistrate or the public the works of third persons, of other authors, translations who contribute to found the nation. They do this in some occasions as part of the action of the state, of government, but not always. So sometimes it is the translator who is the actual self-referential and self-legitimated protagonist of the translating process. These translators that figure in the chapters of the book are then to be considered as being inserted in polemics that are identifiable in the development of the public sphere or the Republic of Letters. But they also translate banned works, for example, published outside the Iberian Peninsula or in secrecy, which has been said to bring forth criticism to the institutional order and the official ideology of enlightened despotism. Another topic is the limits of translatability, which will be addressed next probably by my colleague Adriana Luna-Fabritius. Meanwhile, a range of literary genres and cultural fields are the subject of research that assumes the key to the internal logic of translation. That assumes that the key to the internal logic of translation lies in the emergent needs of its cultural spaces of reception, not in the dissemination of ideas. Ultimately, it is a series of problems inherent to the Catholic monarchy with imperial ambitions that fuel the drive to translate, which the book presents as a unique and long-term defining cultural trait. The main problem is one of language, but it is not so much a matter of determination as of apparent obsolescence. If there is one idea that this book contributes to academic reflection on the Spanish nation, viewed historically, is that by vindicating translation as a defining feature of early modern Hispanic culture, it is both highlighting and creating a problem of enormous depth that proceeds throughout the rest of the old regime and well into the 19th century. The break or discontinuity between the language of the Habsburg era and that of the Bourbons, between the language of the Baroque period and its decline and that of the reforms established to overcome. The translation discussed here, is therefore also, first and foremost, within the same language, from Castilian to Castilian. What the authors of Hispanic culture have witnessed and suffered since the beginning of the 18th century has to do with limits in the adequate understanding of the content of inherited discourses, of semantics altered by the historical dynamics of the language, a dynamic marked by discontinuity. This will make the endeavor to find the nation on translation a frustrated operation in the long run, as it is increasingly admitted through the 18th century that the attempt to gather in a library the entire set of intercultural translations sponsored or embraced by Spanish culture is diluted by its own transgression of limits and by the discontinuity that in terms of imperial legitimacy is imposed by the 18th century and the inter-imperial competition that presides over it, in which the old quarrel of arms and letters, as much as or more that of the ancient and the modern, gives way to a radical change of episteme that leaves the imperial ideology of the Habsburg with its theological foundation in the background compared to the douce commerce that provides with wealth, civilization, and a new foundation and measure of the relations between powers and between nations. Hence, one of the literary or cultural spaces or genres that best expresses and simultaneously activates the epistemic shift and the translator's status as an agent of nation building is through the language of political economy. A lengthy chapter written by the author of this summary, Pablo Sánchez León, is dedicated to this topic, covering the entire period of the long 18th century from 1660s, so starting with the Testament of Philip IV, to the 1830s, the first established constitution of liberalism in Spain. Indeed, political economy and moral philosophy serve in a way as a general framework or scheme from which to observe the entire process of transposition from a Hispanic language of late medieval origin and declining imperial consciousness to the translatable and translated language within the context of European nation states in process of self-affirmation. But the phenomenon that can be traced with its specificities in other cultural fields, then undergoing rapid expansion, such as the natural sciences and scientific thought, a task undertaken by José Manuel Sánchez in the translation. Likewise, the classics, which still occupy the referential space of authority and were the forge of education for cultural audiences, are analyzed by Saúl Martínez Bermejo. For the translation of foreign cultures, of which the Hispanic one was the hinge between the emerging West and an excluded, yet indistinguishable and coterminous East or Orient, which is addressed by Carlos Cañete. Last but not least, law and jurisprudence are examined by Laura Beck-Valera. This leap from triangulation to squaring by including law in the picture will be explored further by Adriana Luna and Portillo. Its culmination in a model constitution promulgated in 1812 in the context of the imperial crisis of 1808, but simmering in controversy throughout the long 18th century and the 19th century, goes beyond attempts to restore the traditional monarchy, reaching as far as the establishment of liberal order in the 1837 Constitution. Before that, let me record a unique piece of culture that this book allows us to rescue from oblivion in a collaborative archaeological effort. The meaning of an entire literature, that of the biblioteca, the library, which in that context did not refer to the gathering of books on shelves. It is also a story of the failure of that literary genre, the frustrated attempts to compile that library of translators as an expression of a national culture born from the very heart of an imperial experience founded on religion, religious proselytism, and universalism, which is what Catholic etymologically means. Indeed, in more than one context in the long 18th century, attempts were made to resume the Herculean task first undertaken around the 1660s by a scholar, Nicolás Antonio, who dedicated years to compiling a library of Hispanic authors organized around the translation of languages from one language to another as a feature of communal identity, precisely when undeniable decline was for the first time opening up a national consciousness in need of carving out a place for itself in the post-Westphalian European order. The legacy of Nicolás Antonio, left to subsequent generations to complete his library compiled in Latin America, will be both a challenge and a course whose traces allows us to transverse the long 18th century in the different genres in which the authors of chapters of the book collect examples of stories and dynamics of translations and battles between translators to capture the rise of a language now called Spanish as a vehicle of communication and expression in the transition to modernity. Adriana, your turn.
Thank you very much, Pablo. I'll try to share my screen. I hope you can see it. Thank you very much for the invitation to this. I think that I have agreed to speak more about the how translation operated as political, legal, and religious tool in the construction of the nation. So this is more like the chapter 7 to 10 in the book. And I will be looking. I did a very different exercise, and I found like 3 different key areas that I would like to discuss here with you today. The first one is the translation of legal theories, especially those of European natural law, and how these ideas were reformulated and resignified in the context of the Spanish monarchy. Secondly, the impact of political legal translations carried out in the Italian peninsula, and how this influenced the development of Enlightenment thought. And finally, a reflection on the translation of the Bible to show how the attempt to preserve textual purity can become an obstacle to critical thinking. My aim in commenting on the final chapters of the book is to highlight that in these cases, translation not only transmits foreign ideas, but transforms them and adapts them to the local contexts, and often even establishes new ways of thinking about the legal, the political, and religious, and above all, the national dimensions. In this sense, translators are not presented as mere technical intermediaries, but as active agents in the production of the nation, because they choose what is said, how it is said, and from what semantic and institutional framework it is interpreted. Let's now look at more closely the different chapters. I of course, I start by chapter 7. That is actually my own contribution, and it examines Naples as a key site for the circulation and critical appropriation of modern natural law within the Spanish monarchy during the 17th and 18th centuries. Let's take this step by step. While it's well known that the Crown of Aragon had a strong Mediterranean presence, many are still surprised to learn that Naples belonged to it for centuries, along with Zaragoza, Valencia, Catalonia, and Mallorca, until the 18th century at the end of the Spanish Succession War. Naples was the third largest city in early modern Europe after London and Paris, and the highest post for Spanish viceroys. It was famously difficult to govern, requiring advanced political and legal expertise. For this reason, it represented the pinnacle of the cursus honorum for the viceroys of the Spanish monarchy. My main argument is that, developed across several publications, is that Naples was fully integrated into the imperial circuits of the Spanish monarchy. It formed part of a broader communication network through which people, ideas, objects, and above all, legal practices circulated. This produce was what I call a normative shared language, but we could also call it Spanish legal culture. These networks stretch from Flanders to Patagonia and from Naples to Philippines. They shape a common, though not uniform, legal language among jurists working within a constantly negotiated imperial system in which local elites had a crucial role. So my chapter doesn't trace literal translations or direct borrowings. Instead, it explores how legal practices and theories were translated, re-articulated, and resignified in response to specific cases, both public and private. A key point here is that modern natural law didn't circulate as a unified doctrine. It was a locally adapted, used differently, and reinterpreted in light of political, religious, and academic context. In my broader work, I describe the Spanish monarchy as a system in constant negotiation, not only between local actors and the king, but often with the Pope as well. So this could make the thing more complicated. So more than a space of mere reception or appropriation, I argue that Naples was a strategic capital for exchange of legal ideas and practices among the lawyers who shape the legal culture of the Spanish monarchy, of which Grotius was also a member. Beyond the confessional divisions that historiography emphasized heavily in the 1990s, I showed that Grotius has to be included in this normative space, as cases he defended were directly mostly against the Spanish monarchical policies. One of the key axes of my chapter relies on the previous research on the reconstruction of communication channels. But that is the topic for another talk. So through these channels, ideas move along among jurists from different corners of the monarchy. And in this chapter, I focus on how legal strategies from Protestant Europe, primarily Germany and the Netherlands, were reread, disputed, and strategically appropriated in Naples, and from there continue to evolve as they migrated elsewhere. The chapter offers concrete examples of several generations of Neapolitan jurists, from Francesco de Andrea to the going through the generation of Giovan Battista Vico, and then we enter into Antonio Genovesi, the father of political economy, and finally arrive to the generation of Filangieri and Pagan. Over more than a century, these thinkers didn't merely translate a passive recipients, but they were active interpreters, generating semantic layers where concepts such as sociability, utility, civil authority, public happiness, or jurisdiction acquired new meanings. So, moving to the next chapter, the title Translations of Legal Political Text in the Italian Peninsula in the 18th and 19th century, written by Patricia De Salvo. In this chapter, she explores how legal and political texts circulated and were transformed across the Italian peninsula between the 18th and the 19th century. She pays particular attention to how translation shaped the reception of Enlightenment thought and helped reconfigure constitutional language in the different Italian states. The chapter looks at various pre-unification texts such as Kingdom of Naples, Piedmont, Tuscany, and the Duchy of Milan, each with its own institutions, censorship system, and political priorities. This approach helps us to see how European political thought was translated, edited, and adapted to highly diverse local conditions, although the chapter doesn't reconstruct the local context behind each translation. The work of De Salvo also includes translations of major Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, Beccaria, Filangieri, Bularmaki, or Delorme. De Salvo shows that translation was far from neutral. It was a deeply mediated practice shaped by both editorial strategies and ideological decisions. One key concept she introduces is that of chains of translations, referring texts that don't derive from original but from earlier translations. For example, an English work might reach Italian through an already modified French version. This creates a process of successive rewritings where meaning shift through each layer of mediation. I find this particularly interesting as it referred to a similar process in my own work that I call semantic layering. I think we are describing the same kind of phenomenon despite we proceed in a very different way. A striking example is the multitude Italian editions of Montesquieu's L'Esprit des Lois, which circulated in many versions, some censored, others abridged, or adapted for school use. These variations show how translations don't merely produce ideas, but actively reshape some of the founding text of modern political thought. Although De Salvo doesn't develop a theory of the translator as an autonomous historical figure, her analysis clearly points to the importance of translators as ideological and linguistic mediators. Even though she doesn't define them explicitly or study them as concrete historical actors, I would argue this role is implicit throughout the chapter. And again, this aligns closely with my own approach. We don't get the names, backgrounds, or institutional affiliations of the translations, but the changes are tracked through the text themselves, rather than through a reconstruction of their production. Still, the variations between versions clearly show how crucial these translators were in shaping how Enlightenment political ideas were received, filtered, and neutralized. One of the most important examples in the chapter is the translation of 1812 Cadiz Constitution into Italian. And these translations were published in different cities, Rome, Palermo, and Piacenza, but probably Chema Portillo will talk more about this in his intervention. De Salvo offers a precise philological reading of translation as an editorial, textual, and political practice. And while, as I mentioned earlier, she doesn't explore the translations as historical agents or look into the constitutions behind the publications, she still manages to show how Italian versions of Enlightenment and constitutional text play an active role in the transformation of modern political thought. Perhaps the most important contribution of this chapter is translation beyond language is a space of ideological struggle, where the possibility of introducing, adapting, or even blocking ideas such as sovereignty, law, or citizenship is constantly being renegotiated. One small, I'm going to move now to the chapter number 5, to the chapter number 9. That is one of my favorite, I have to confess. This chapter, translation as metaphor by Pablo Fernández Albaladejo, takes a rather different turn. Instead of analyzing specific translations or case studies, he offers a theoretical and conceptual reflection on translation itself, not as a technical or linguistic act, but as foundational metaphor for modern political thought and for the emergence of the nation. His central thesis is striking. Translation, particularly in the context of the crisis of the Ancien Regime and the rise of new forms of political and historical legitimacy, becomes a structuring figure of political modernity. The translator in this view is not just a philologist, but an epistemic agent, a mediator between past and present, between knowledge system and structures of authority. One of the key contributions of the chapter is showing that translation is never neutral or innocent. It is not simply a technical task. Translation involves selection, displacement, and the substitution of meaning. Albaladejo challenges the idea of translation as a transparent, mechanical transfer of meaning. And for him, the translator doesn't just carry over a text from one language to another. They reorganize temporalities, reshape hierarchies, and redefine legitimacy. In fact, just as translation alters its source in the very act of translating, the modern nation is formed through similar processes of appropriation and discursive reorganization. As you can imagine, I found strong parallels here as well with my own work, and I couldn't agree more with the underlying assumptions. Specifically in the aftermath of 1808, when the old theological and providential foundations of authority collapse, translation becomes a discursive mechanism of foundation. It replaces divine and sacred authority with secular, historical, and national legitimacy. So to put it simply, translating becomes a way for a community to redefine itself, to represent its own origins, its shared language, and its imagined future. The translator may not be a sovereign or a legislator, but he acts as a foundational figure within a political culture in transition. So another powerful idea in this chapter is the image of the translator as a modern figure marked by epistemic instability. The translator can't claim absolute authority, but he enables meaning. He doesn't own the truth, but he makes things legible. In a context where sacred or transcendent references have faded, the translator operates across languages, times, and systems of knowledge. They translate from theology to law, from law to history, from history to national discourse. This chain of translations is how authority shifts from divine foundations to a secular, discursive national order. One of the most incisive arguments in this chapter is the modern nation emerges as a translation from multiplicity to unity. In other words, it's a symbolic unification of diverse languages, times, and memories. And this operation involves violence and a form of symbolic imposition. Translation in this context means forcing equivalence where there is in fact conflict. It means ranking meanings, silencing what cannot be translated, and presenting unity where there is historical fragmentation. Fernández Albaladejo is very clear about this. While the Enlightenment promised transparency and historical continuity, the modern nation is based on fracture, strategy, and artifice. It pretends to be neutral, but its coherence depends precisely on hiding the work of translation behind it. In the final pages, Fernández Albaladejo introduces a new figure, that is the enlightened translator, who no longer believes in the transparency of his own task. Unlike the classical translator who believes in full equivalence, the modern translator knows that all translation is partial, failed, and situated. From his awareness emerges a kind of ethics of translation, marked by irony, skepticism, and melancholy. This enlightened translator, conscious of his own limitations, becomes in Fernández Albaladejo's eyes a critical figure, one who relates to the past and to power with distance, reflection, and uneasy. In short, this is a deeply sophisticated chapter offering a theoretical framework that helps us think about translation as a political and epistemic category, one that is key to understand the Hispanic modern world. The translator is revealed as a strategic figure of modernity, but also as a symptom of its internal tensions between knowledge and power, between continuity and rupture, between history and myth. From this angle, the modern nation is not simply an invention. It is a translation of the past into a coherent narrative of collective identity. But in that process, what is excessive, unspeakable, and untranslatable gets left out. So the final chapter is the chapter of one of our editors, José María Iñurritegui, who take us into a unique and particularly complex terrain, the biblical translation in the Hispanic modern world. Unlike the previous chapters who explore political and legal translations that open a space for critical interpretation, here the focus shifts to a kind of translation that deliberately renounces that transformative power. Iñurritegui examines how the translation of the Bible into Castilian under Catholic supervision became a highly regulated and doctrinal controlled practice. The goal was not to engage in critical mediation, but to preserve theological purity. In contrast to the Protestant model, with Luther as the emblematic case, where translating the Bible involved reinterpretation and accessibility for the wider community, the Catholic approach positioned translation as a mechanism of ecclesiastical authority intended to prevent any rewriting or ambiguity. One of the chapter's core insights is that Catholic biblical translation doesn't invite interpretation. It insists on absolute fidelity, which ultimately results in textual immobility. Iñurritegui discusses cases like the Shio Bible or the Nácar Colunga Bible, showing how the translation process, framed as philologically neutral, is actually an exercise in institutional control disguised as fidelity. Here, translation doesn't reinterpret or displace meaning. It seeks to reproduce the already consecrated. The idea of textual fixity has a paradoxical effect. It attempts to eliminate ambiguity, but in so doing, it hides conflicts and transforms it into dogma. The title of the chapter, A Critical Bible Translation Without Rewriting, captures its argument very well. In the Catholic Hispanic world, biblical translation doesn't function as a space for critical engagement or semantic transformation, but as a tool for textual fixation, where the possibility of introducing a contemporary reading is suspended. In a broader context of the book, which sees the nation as the product of multiple acts of translation, this chapter represents a limit case. Here, translation no longer founds or enables. It preserves, repeats, and blocks reinterpretation. Although Iñurritegui doesn't explicitly frame this as a rejection of Enlightenment logic, the tension is kind of clear. This model of translation clashes with the rationalizing project seen in earlier chapters. Rather than enabling modern discourses, the biblical translation described here operates within a paradigm of authority that inhibits new perspective agencies. So this chapter functions as a necessary counterpoint to the rest of the volume, while other chapters frame translation as critical agency, political operation, or constructive metaphor. Here we see the reverse, translations as a mechanism of institutional closure. Iñurritegui doesn't claim that the nation is explicitly blocked, but he does show that in this context, the conditions for translation as a generator of community or national discourse are effectively suspended. Rather than closing the book's argument, this final chapter actually problematizes it. It raises crucial questions. What happens when a culture refuses all semantic displacement? What kind of community emerges from a translation that rejects critique in the name of fidelity? Can a modern enlightened nation exist without critical translation? I want to show this other slide. So the chapter doesn't offer definitive answers, but it does suggest one thing. For translation to be foundational politically, culturally, or epistemologically, it must allow for rewriting, contestation, and transformation. When that possibility is denied, what remains is text as immutable authority, not as a shared foundation for rebuilding community. To conclude my intervention, I think that these final 4 chapters of the translated nation do more than present specific cases of juridical, political, or religious translation. I think that taken together, they offer a broader reflection on the limits and possibilities of translation as a constitutive act within the Hispanic modern world. From Naples to Italian courts, from constitutional discourses to biblical translations, one thing becomes clear. Translation is never just about transferring meaning. It is about intervening in it. In some cases, such intervention opens new forms of community, legality, and national discourse. In others, as we have seen, it becomes an exercise in authoritarian preservation where the past is imposed and left untouched. If the book's central premise is that the modern nation is also constructed through translations, then these chapters remind us that not all translations are founding. Some enable that process, some quite simply limit it. So the proposal that emerges from these chapters is twofold. First, to recognize translation as a form of political, legal, and epistemic agency, capable of articulating common ground from difference. And second, to acknowledge that when translations abandon critical potential, it also suspends the very possibility of a new community, one open to conflict, negotiation, and change. So to conclude, in that sense, this book doesn't offer a single unified theory of national formation, but rather a cartography of translational practices that force us to rethink how the languages of the national have been formed and how they might continue to evolve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Now is the turn for José María Portillo to present some comments on the book, of which he is also a contributor, with a kind of an epilogue, final chapter on the sort of consequences in the longer term of the approach that the book presents.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. I think that you and Adriana have explained very well the content of different chapters of this book, and I would try to, I think that my contribution here could be more trying to explain our international colleagues why they should consider in reading this book as a companion for the understanding of issues related to nation and nationalism in Spanish history, and why should even consider the possibility of publishing this book in English, because I think that this is a very good and a very innovative approach to these studies in from Spanish historiography. This is a very different book on these issues, probably from other books you might be more familiar with. For example, if you have read on Spain as a Spanish nation and Spanish nationalism in history, you probably have read scholars like Núñez Seixas, for example, who is a very good historian, but his approach to nation and nationalism in Spain is more related to the ways in which the different Spanish national identities in Catalonia, in the Basque Country, in Spain, in Galicia, and other parts of Spain arose by the end of the 19th century. And it is obvious that for the Spanish historiography, issues related to nation and nationalism are more related to this period of late 19th century and, of course, in the 20th century. So we are more used to this approach, and probably international colleagues are more used to read about Spanish history and the problem of nationality in Spanish history, more related to this approach, which I think that is very important. But I also think that this book can offer a very different approach to this question. And why I think that is very original, this book, and this is original, I would say, not only in related to the Spanish area, but I would say that also in European terms is very innovative, this book. I would refer just to a couple of aspects in which I think that you can see this innovation of this book in the context of European historiography related to the problem of nations and nationalisms in the history of Europe. First is maybe not that original, but in the context of Spanish history, absolutely it is, not maybe that much in the context of European history, is about chronology. The chronology of this book is very strange for talking about nation. You can see the subtitle of this book is translation as ecology in a long 18th century. Ecology here has nothing to do with climate change or things like this. Ecology here has to do with oikos logos. This is that is the idea of how historically was set up and it was created an idea that something like a Spanish national oikos could exist, and also what are the norms and the rules of for the function of this oikos in the Spanish history. This is the sense of this word ecologia here. That is as I said, nothing to do with ecology in the contemporary meaning of this. I'm focusing now on the second part of the subtitle, En un siglo XVIII largo, in a long 18th century. Really long 18th century, because it starts by the end of the 17th century, and it arrives in principle to the beginning of the 19th century. So from the 70s and 80s in the 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century is a very long 18th century. And I think that this is something that absolutely singularized this book in the context of Spanish history. Okay, I don't know about any other book that considered the idea of nationalism in Spain in this with this chronology. And the second originality of this book to me is the approach to the study of nation, and not that much nationalism, because I think that nationalism is not the idea of this book, but this is also very important for the understanding of the origins of nationalism in Spain. That is the reason why I am using in this presentation constantly these words together, nation and nationalism, because differently from other approaches to the history of nation in Spain, the authors and above all the editors of this book considered that their problem was not the emerging of different national identities in the Spanish context. That actually it is not a problem for this book, but they are more interested in how the idea of Spanish nation was translated, that is, was transported, that is, was circulating from one contextual conception to others. And I think that this is the reason why they are able to go from the end of the 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century. Preliminary, the point of arrival of this book is this one, the beginning of the 19th century. Why? Because at the beginning of the 19th century, in 1812, for the first time, the Spanish nation was constitutionally defined in the Constitution of Cádiz. And when this occurred for the first time in 1812, they said that the Spanish nation was the reunion of all the Spaniards from both hemispheres. If we read European intellectuals commenting the Spanish Constitution, the Spanish Constitution of 1812, for example, Jeremy Bentham or the French Gérard de Prat, they were certainly surprised by this definition. Above all, Jeremy Bentham. Imagine Jeremy Bentham reading this, that the Spanish nation was the reunion of all the Spaniards from both hemispheres, so from Manila to Mexico, to Buenos Aires and to Madrid, all this ancient, huge Spanish monarchy is now defined as the Spanish nation. And the conclusion of Jeremy Bentham in the 20s of the 19th century, when the Spanish Constitution of 1812 was again alive, was that the Spanish people was really crazy and out of mind if they thought that a modern nation could be defined as the ancient empire. But this is the case. This is the case. And this is the important point here, that they did so very, very conscious of what they were doing when they said that the Spanish nation was this. Additionally, this constitution hadn't a declaration of rights of the individuals, of Spanish citizens, but it had something like a Declaration of Rights of the Spanish nation in the first articles of the Constitution. So all this was very surprising for the European intellectuals. But this was the way that the first Spanish liberalism and the first Spanish constitutionalism wanted to talk about the Spanish nation. So I think that it is very interesting, as the editors of this book proposed, to analyze and to study what are the different layers of conceptual translation of the Spanish nation in order to arrive to this surprising first Spanish constitutional definition of the Spanish nation. I'm not sure that this book should finish by the beginning of the 19th century. I think that this problem goes along with the Spanish history, probably up to our own the present time. The present Spanish Constitution, differently from other European constitutions of the second half of the 20th century, has a lot of references to history. Not only to, let's say, rhetorical references to history, but constituent references to history. History today is constituting the Spanish nation. So probably this kind of approaches to the study of a Spanish nation could be a very good complement to each other studies on the different manifestations of the national identities in Spain by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And this is the reason why I think that this is a very important book, and the reason why I think that other European and international colleagues should read this book in order to better understand the origins of this surprising definition of the Spanish nation in contemporary times.
Wow, thank you very much, Chema. I think that I'm going to see myself in the picture again. Just to finish this seminar and this session that we have been presenting La Nación Traducida for foreigners, people that would, if they read Spanish, they should really try to get this book. And as Chema just argued, I think with good reason, it would be really beneficial to translate it to other languages. And its complexity is also a way of placing the Spanish historical experience in the situation and the place it really deserves in the not only the European but the globalized history we were building. Thank you very much, Adriana. Thank you very much, Chema.
Thank you.
And we will continue with other sessions in the coming future. Bye bye.